Good day to all of you students. My name is Dr. 𝐂𝐃𝐲𝐫𝐞𝐳. I'm the Professor of International Business and welcome to the Innovative Knowledge Institute Paris Graduate School MBA lecture series. And today we'll start off with the very first module, which you'll see in your portal, which is the International Business Strategy. And I will start with the first week's lecture on globalization. And as you know, you must have heard the term globalization. Most of you know what it means, but today we're going to go in quite in-depth detail on the aspects of globalizations and the impact it has on the world as we know today. Now, if we look at the slide at the end of this actual class, you should be able to understand what is meant by globalization there. Okay, you've heard the term. It's been used in the news media, and I'm sure you've got your own ideas about globalization and the controversy it's caused. Also, we'll look at the main drivers of globalization, okay, and then the changing nature of the global economy. And as you know, especially after the pandemic, how the global economy has had a seismic shift as well. We're now entering periods of great uncertainty and obviously recession in most of the world economies. So we'll look at that. Then we'll explain the main arguments and the debates on the impact of globalization, which, you know, if you've looked at the news, over the last few years, you've seen loads of protests in, major capitals of the US and Europe, whereby there's a lot of protesters against the impact of globalization, and it's caused so much, adverse reaction in the media as well. Finally, at the end of this class, at the end of this session, you should be able to understand how the process of globalization is also, at the end of this today, also creating opportunities as well, and challenges for managers. So it's something that it's something that is a very important topic in MBA programs throughout universities and institutions globally. So first things first, at the beginning I asked you, do you know what globalization is? And most of you will have a good idea. But if we look at the academia, it can be put into the globalization of markets. And this refers to the emerging historical, distinct and separate national markets into one huge global marketplace. I mean, we've now, because of the advent of technology, we call it the global village. When it was first muted back in the 1980s. When I was a student, all those years back, we came across that terminology first. It was more about with the technology at that time. Remember, it was during the 80s. We had Microsoft, we had all these technology companies from the US that were making an impact on the global marketplace. Okay, but that also meant falling barriers to trade, border trade and investments. Prior to that, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, foreign trade was so expensive. Barriers to trade was as countries became very protectionist. And what happened is they had to make sure that goods that they sold had a real premium price on it. And when we looked at also not just the investment part of it, but global tastes were changing. The world was changing at that time as well. In Asia, there was more insatiable appetite for more Western goods and services. So we had this different types of from different cultures, products and services, and this also benefited globalization. Benefited small, not just your big multinationals, but small, medium-sized enterprises as well, were being had very, very favorable impact. Also, when we look at this, significant differences between national market, yes, there are different, distinct national markets. But you know what you can do? The world has gone into trade blocks as well, and different cultures within trade blocks. So if you look at as an example, when you look at the Indian subcontinent, in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, certain product or service will be quite similar. When if you look at clothing, when you look at food, spicy food and products like that. So, and you can group also South American countries, who are, from Argentina, Brazil, Spanish-speaking, Portuguese-speaking countries. So, although those national distinctions, and also if you do recall, from the 1990s onwards, we had a lot more countries that came about, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We had the Russians, it was called the Soviet Union. I mean, a lot of people have never heard of Lithuania, Ukraine, Estonia. They were all part of the Soviet Empire. And the Balkans War back in 1992, we had Yugoslavia. Everyone heard of Yugoslavia, but they never heard of Bosnia or Montenegro, Croatia, Serbia. They all broke up, and new markets, distinct markets, different levels of taste were also then were quite apparent in those days. So yes, we have different types of national market, and we'll look at that later as well. What are the products as well? The universal needs of global oil. I mean, oil prices, even today, the impact of COVID, oil prices have shot up. A lot of countries are in recession. Obviously, the oil price has an impact. And back in the 70s, when OPEC is obviously oil-producing nations, there's only a few nations who actually set the price as well. That has an impact on the global economy. Finally, competition may not change among nations, but competitive environment, it's become so intense. As technology, before, I remember when I was a student, we only had one telecom company in the UK, which is British Telecom, and we couldn't obviously change if we wanted to. But since mobile phones came and all this prices were obviously came tumbling down, it made it a lot more easier for communication. So, but again, with that, we had O2, Vodafone. We had very intense competition that became part of the environment that we had. And now on this slide, what you'll see, which, to be honest, it just sort of encompasses everything we've just said so far. Its impact, the benefits and risks. Globalization, yes, so much benefits. Jobs, job creation, outsourcing. You might have come across that. India has developed through its outsourcing. And I remember when I was young, if we needed to know the train times from Liverpool to Manchester, we used to just pick up the phone and we used to call about the platform, which platform the trains were going through. But then back in the 80s, they started we've got Indian voices on the other side, which is something different as well. But obviously outsourcing made sense. It made sense because of the competitive nature. It was a lot cheaper. Firms had to look at that. So again, we talked about technological innovation, and we'll keep talking about that. But that also led to a lot of foreign direct investments. Okay, and obviously breakdown of the Berlin Wall. More and more countries. They were independent. They had their own needs, product services, and it sort of grew. Obviously, American companies led the way. With technological, if you look at it, Microsoft, Dell computers, they all were there right in the forefront of technology, and they were part of the drivers. And obviously, you have and this is where the debate on globalization is. If you look at that, obviously it was unequal distribution. Some people were saying the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer. Yes, there's arguments about that. And even in countries like India, the disparity between the poor and the rich is so much apparent. If you go to a city like Bombay, a massive metro city, has a population of over 20 million. Right next to all the all the Bollywood stars who are living in 12 million pound houses, you had the squalor, you had all the shanty towns right there, and that was very apparent. And that's one of the arguments against globalization, that it didn't help much of everyone in the economy. There was just unequal distribution, and you had threat to sovereignty as well. Again, country sovereignty were at stake. Some foreign direct investments, like the oil companies, were more powerful than the countries themselves. If you look at Nigeria, Shell Nigeria started to dictate the Nigerian government. Okay, so there was again a lot of corruption, a lot of aspects that was seized upon by a lot of anti-globalization, obviously pressure groups who thought, hold on, there's something wrong here. And obviously these generals who ran Nigeria got richer and richer. So again, there was a lot of arguments on that. But then on the other side of it, obviously when you look at economies of scale, with larger companies, they could afford, to look at economies of scale where products were made cheaper as well. When we look at car manufacturing, which is huge in the global economy, they outsourced. Nissan, back in the 70s, Nissan outsourced all their production to Sunderland in the UK. So, rather than shipping them over, that was part of the whole globalization process. Factories were being shut down in the Western world, and they were being transferred. How did the Bangladesh garments, ready-made garments industry become so successful? Because factories, which we had in the Yorkshire towns back in the 1950s and 60s of Dewsbury, Bradford, Sheffield, they all sort of decreased their output, and all of it then eventually the factories closed and jobs were exported back into India and Bangladesh and Philippines and countries like that. So all of this, there's interdependence between it all as well. Now, again, I mentioned that sourcing, globalization of production, obviously very expensive to make clothing in the UK, as you know. So obviously with the low cost of labor in Bangladesh, in countries like Bangladesh and India, these companies started thriving, although the cost of production was so much lower, including labor, land, capital. So it made sense. It made a lot of economic sense for companies, clothing companies. I'm just using that as an example, such as River Island, the UK brands. They started outsourcing all of their production. First it was partial, but then when you outsource all your production, you're also going to lose a bit of control as well. But then modern technology has helped in all this. In the old days, we used to send faxes over, but now with technology, everything, all the cuttings, all the exact details you want to is actually sent obviously through computers. And again, when we look at Robert Reich, he wrote a lot on, he was like one of the authorities on globalization and the global product. Take an example, Sony or Nokia. I mean, Nokia obviously was one of the top telecom companies in our day, but we never knew, most people didn't know that Nokia comes from Finland, Sony comes from Japan. It's more known as a global company. Today, when we think about Microsoft, we don't really think of it as an American company. We think of it more as a global company because we use it in our everyday lives. When we open the computer, Microsoft Office is there, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, what we're using today, well, what I'm using in today's lecture. Okay, so there were a lot of, when we look at activities, formal and informal barriers to trade, barriers to foreign direct investments were put in, and then we look at transportation costs, and obviously with that we had a lot of political and economic risk in different types of the world as well. So South America, the devaluation of the Argentinian currency back in the 1970s had a major impact. And just a few years back, just a decade ago, if you'll recall, Greece almost went bankrupt and the EU had to bail it out. The Greek currency was absolutely worthless. Okay, and we have so many examples of this throughout the globalization history. So there was a real challenge, and you know, again, something like supply chain management, supply chain became so vital, and the reason for that was, if you look at this diagram that I've got here, this has led to globalization. You know, the whole container ships full of goods. You know, when we, in the old days and back in the 70s, we had disputes at the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was a small little canal that linked, Asia to Europe, Africa, Asia to Europe, and that because of the Israeli war. Again, when I'm talking about political, we had the Israeli-Arab conflict, and these were blocked as well. So goods from Asia had to be sort of diverted, and obviously the lead time was increased as well. But thankfully now we've got containerization, bringing huge number of containers full of cars, full of products, full of services, all into one. And we had lower trade barriers. You know, we started getting to trade blocks. We'll look at that in a short while. Trade blocks like NAFTA, EU. So countries got together. They realized they had to collaborate, not being separate nations. So Britain was at that time, Britain was part of the EU. So they spoke with one voice, both political and economically. So you might have your own say on Brexit, but in those days, it was just through one voice. And then you had, there's so much business demand because of consumerization. We had so much more products in the market thanks to technology. So with this, enabled a lot of, you know, creation of products, demand for products in Asia. And as you know, India, China, you know, account for 40% of the world's population. And what do? All sorts of products. And China also started making so much new product because of labor costs. They're so cheap labor back in the 70s and 80s when it all started. And obviously America, who's, well, the Americans who actually we used to produce a lot of the world products then, obviously got quite worried about this as well. So there's a lot of, you know, anti-globalization lobbies within the American nation. And as you know, when Trump came into power a few years back, he was the one who really said, American jobs, bring back the jobs from the Philippines, from India, from China, bring them back, from Mexico, just across the border. But then again, it wasn't feasible because America, you have to pay a minimum wage of what, you know, $10, $11, $12 an hour. Is that affordable? That's why if you look at the Rust Belt where Trump got most of his votes, they're the ones that they lost out on globalization. All these towns around the Mississippi, the actual what they call the Rust Belt of the Midwest and things like this. So they lost out. They were losing jobs, and we had the big crisis back in 2008. If you'll recall that, the financial crisis of 2008 was absolutely horrendous. It had such an impact on the American. Obviously, if you all know, if America catches a cold, the rest of the world also catches that cold as well. So it had a major impact. And I don't have to introduce the last one, is technological advances. By all means, that has made such an impact. Now, also, in your other MBA modules, you might have come across, well, in your earlier studies, you might have come across the emergence of global institutions, which were back from because after the Second World War, nations needed to come together. Germany, the two countries that lost the war, Japan and Germany, can you imagine? They were scarred psychologically, but guess what? They are on warfare. They started to go on warfare, not by fighting anymore, but by their products. Japan, the Sony Corporation, Nissan, Toyota, their cars became number one, the most popular cars. Past 10 years, they've taken Ford as the number one car manufacturer. How did they do it? Benchmarking. They started observing. The Japanese, after the war, back in the 50s, they went to see how best the cars were made. Ford was number one. I remember back in the 60s, no one owned a German car. No one owned, in England, I'm talking about when I was growing up in England, no one owned a German car. Very few people had Japanese cars. Why? People didn't want to buy German cars. We just lost the war, just 20 years earlier. They didn't want to buy Japanese cars, but Japanese cars at that time, they had brilliant engines. Even when it was -10, it still used to work, but the bodies weren't very good. But guess what? They perfected the body. They went to see how the Ford body was made. So wintertime, the American winters can be very harsh in some areas of New York and Washington and the Midwest and obviously Alaska, which is part of the US. How did they withstand the winter there? The car bodies, they perfected it. Toyota is now the number one car manufacturer in the United States. They sell the most cars. So, because of the war, because of all these politics, because of new countries coming into emergence, you had what this slide is on is the global institution. It's called the General Agreement, the GATT as it's known for short. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Lower the barriers, let countries trade, and then we had the World Trade Organization. They all got together. The IMF, you will have heard of the IMF, International Monetary Fund. They used to set out financial policies. The World Bank helping countries like the emergence of India that was coming out of the 1970s, or coming out into the new world with their products. Tata Cars started coming up. Tata Consultancy. So Indian companies, Chinese companies were also were even growing at such a rate at that time that you needed obviously help. And the World Bank helped as well with a lot of projects, especially in poorer countries like Bangladesh at that time, back in the 70s. So that had to also make sure that they were being competitive as well. And finally, the United Nations, which were here from the 1940s, that brokered the peace deals, in the Arab conflict and the Second World War. And it was after the Second World War, that's why the United Nations said, right, we will not fight, we'll all get together, the United Nations Assembly, any issues, any political, any economic, any financial, should be resolved by getting together, all about collaboration. So the world suddenly became the horrific Second World War. And the First World War before that was also bad. Millions and millions of people have died. And we had the Indian independence where millions have died. Let's all get together and, make sure that our companies prosper. If our companies prosper, our countries, our nations prosper. Very simple adage there. And when the World Trade, I'm not going to go too much into this as well. Just when it comes to the emergence of global institutions, but the World Trade Organization, as you can see, 164 nations that account for 98% of the world trade were members in 2019. This is the latest figure back in 2019. 164 nations all getting together. 98% of the world trade was done. And then you got the World Bank, which promotes economic development. Various projects like infrastructure projects and all that were financed by the World Bank. So see a country, if it gets a proper infrastructure of its roads, its railways, its in proper schooling, proper education, they're giving loans that will help some crash-strapped governments in poorer countries to invest in that. Bangladesh currently is investing heavily on its infrastructure projects. We had the Padma Bridge here in Bangladesh that was set up and very successful, linking one part of the country to the other. Motorways, the metro line. In Africa, we had different projects there in South Africa, in southern parts of the African states as well. But it's also considered less controversial than the IMF, which obviously had its critics as well. So the emergence of these institutions was so important, and it's all about let's collaborate to make sure that the economically and also human rights as well, politically, there was some very terrible tyrants in power as well, dictatorships as well. They also didn't help. So countries got involved. They became more and more cooperative in that way. So obviously, help countries to help themselves. That was the motto. Help nations to help themselves. And you might have come across the group of 20, G20, finance ministers and central bank governors of the 19 world governors and finance would get together. And this is always happening, at least twice a year. And they represent 90% of the global GDP and 80% of international global trade. Hold on, that's very important. And you need to get together on a table wherever in Geneva or in New Delhi just to iron those things out. So that's important. Now, what are the drivers of trade? Drivers of globalization? Well, trade, if we look at the history, I'm not going to go too much onto it, just give you a brief overview. The 1920s saw many barriers to international trade investments. There's so many barriers at that time in those formative years, okay? But then it took a more of a big step. And I remember I did say it was after the First World War, things started to move as well. But then we had the Second World War that got in the way back in the 1940s. So foreign direct were a firm invest resource. So countries like America, who had the big companies, the big oil companies, Britain, who had GE, British American Tobacco, and you had the oil companies that they had, the Shell, BP. They went into different markets of the world. Again, they had their critics because they said, is foreign, and still now, the question you'll find in your studies, your MBA studies, is foreign direct investment a good thing? And this you'll find in your assignments and examination. I've set quite a few, and that is a very popular question, because remember, when you do your questioning, when you do your assignments, you've got to have counter arguments for and against, and you've got to explain it by giving real life examples like I'm giving in this lecture. And then when we look on this lecture here, what we'll look at is, the production process was going to different locations. I've already mentioned that. In Bangladesh, we had the clothing industry, and it became so successful, even today. If you look at most of the product, if you go to most of the shops, the clothes shop in London or New York, you'll see now the labels made in Bangladesh. Before, it was like, oh no, we can't put that. We'll just put our own label. But you know why they put made in Bangladesh? Because everyone now knows it's a sign of quality, okay? In the next 10 years, next 20 years, you'll have your Indian products, you'll have your Tata cars, you'll have your Chinese companies, very well known. Like previous generations, we have the German and the Japanese companies as well. Past 2 decades, most countries have become a lot wealthier. And this had no doubt been the effect of globalization, the positive aspects of it. in the next slide, when we look at this, you'll see the graph. You see a graph there. Value of world merchandise trade and production between 1960 to 2019. Okay, have a look. The 60 years there. And if you look at the graph, obviously you can see a real upward aspect to it. Obviously 2019, we had the start of the COVID. So when you look at future graphs now, obviously there'll be a down peak as well. But it was always on upward trajectory, and it's something that had positive impacts. Then again, when I showed you the beginning of the lecture, when I showed you the diagram, one of the roles is technological change, and that without saying, that is one of the most important aspects of the development. Okay, and after the Second World War, when I was at university back in the early 1980s, mid 80s, the computers weren't there. We had the big mainframe processors, but when I was doing my assignments and all that, it was all by pen, and we had to go to the library. We didn't have all these word processors. It came after the mid 80s, late 80s. That's when it really, and to every home. It went in the sort of the 90s as well. Now you'll see something called here the actual Moore's law. Okay, what is the Moore's law? The Moore's law predicts the power of microwave technology doubles and the cost of production falls in every 18 months. So it's something of, we have got megabyte, we had gigabyte. If you think of next 10 years of technological change, how this will even go, into a different level completely. So obviously the internet, nowadays, you can sell your products. Obviously, you've heard of the terminology. You've heard of the terminology e-commerce. But e-commerce, the sales is 2.5 trillion and growing. And obviously, look at half the world's population now uses the internet. Billions and billions, half the world's population, and that is growing. So next 20 years, it'll be 2/3 of the world's population. Further, and with this, obviously with the technological train, this has led to transportation, the logistics, supply chain management, which is one area that obviously you'll come across in your MBA studies, and how important supply chain management is. But technological change has enabled this as well. And, God, I remember, all those years back in the 60s, it used to take, whole day, couple of days just to go from one location to another. I remember London to Dhaka used to take 32 hours. Now it takes 12 hours. What will happen in 50 years? Our grandchildren? It could take literally 1 hour from going from London to Sydney by satellite technology. It might just only take 1 hour in the next 50 years. And it's already started. Space technology has already started with this. And locating, is obviously within this slide, locating the actual production in separate location has becoming more economical. I mentioned that as well. But the cost is so much less. That's why, I'll give you an example. Primark, which is a very successful clothing store in the UK. Every city and every town that you go, there's a Primark. Now, who has heard of Primark 15 years ago? No one. It wasn't there. If you had to buy clothes in England, you had to go to the designer stores, you had to go to Tesco's and places like that. You had to go to the Oxford Street in London to buy your clothes, River Island, Topshop. A pair of jeans was 60, 70 pounds. How much is a pair of jeans in Primark? Those of you who go shopping there, 10 pounds, 12 pounds for a pair of jeans. Okay, so much cheaper. Why? Because the cost of producing a jeans only is $2. You've got all those factory girls working. Obviously they're getting the minimum pay, and companies now are making sure child labour are not apparent in those factories, which obviously starts with a lot of child labour. But then we've got all these factory workers who it's a lot cheaper than having someone in London making the jeans, a lot cheaper. Hence, who are the beneficial people from this is the customers. The customers get everything really cheap now. And you can buy things, through mail order, through eBay and Amazon now. So everything's become so cheaper because of technological advances. And finally on this, what are the implications here for cultural differences here? And cultural differences has reduced and has brought some convergence of consumer taste and preferences. We now have YouTube. The younger generation are so much more knowledgeable about other cultures, about other tastes, and what people in Azerbaijan eat and places like that, but just by watching YouTube, okay? And we have so much of that available. So especially when you look in Britain, our cities and towns have become so much more diverse. We see so many people of different nationalities. You're at university now, you're studying there, and what you'll see that there's so many different nationalities, and you're learning of these nationalities, not through just your academic studies. That leads me coming to the cultural change, changing demographics of the global economy. I've just mentioned that, I've just touched on that. And if you look back in history, if you look back in 1960s, US accounted for 38% of the world output. It's almost half. Look at the recent figure of 2000. It's reduced significantly because obviously China and India, and especially China, this is why China now and the BRIC, you're aware of the BRIC countries, aren't you? Which is, China and South America, Brazil, Russia. B stands for Brazil, R for Russia. The BRIC countries that they're known, they're growing rapidly. The African countries, which are part of that, are growing. Nigeria is one of the biggest economies in Africa. South Africa as well, since the fall of the apartheid system, has also been welcomed into the world stage, both politically and economically. And so, look at this. Finally there, developing nations have account for more than 60% of the world economic activity in 3 years' time. It'll account for 60%. So it's a huge shift from the US. So the US companies have to be more competitive. And when you look at the changing foreign direct investment picture, obviously, as barriers as barriers fall, you're going to get more and more trade between the nations, and what it'll lead to is major foreign investments, and that's what companies are doing. But remember, foreign investment also brings about some of the negative aspects, and this is what people blame it onto the advent of globalization. So we've got to be aware of that. Some people are saying our cultures are being eroded. I'll give you an example. Here in France, the French love to drink coffee and tea with a cup, and they like to relax in a coffee shop. But have you noticed with Starbucks and all these coffee shops like Gloria Jeans, they've come into the market, obviously the Western markets first, and they've made a culture, and McDonald's has, Burger King has, of fast food, okay? Where you just take it, you're in a hurry, you need to have had the food very quickly, a burger and a can of Coke quickly, okay? So, but some cultures don't like that. And living in France for the last few years, I've come across that they would rather take time in having their lunch, take time in eating and sipping a cup of coffee, where they do a lot of business as well. So all these aspects there, and you'll learn more on this when we look at other modules like strategic HR and other modules that you have in your MBA. You'll find a lot in that as well. Okay. Now, finally, just have a look at the last few slides here, which will show you, and again, as you can see, from 1995 to 2018, I've got the actual data here of outward stock. Okay, so in your spare time, take a look at that. United Nations in FDI inflow, again on the upward trajectory, and the changing demographics as well. And again, we've mentioned that non-US ones are being more and more active now from China and India. Okay, and again, the rise of the mini multinationals you'll see as well, smaller, but they are multinational, but they're a bit smaller than the huge concerns from the past. And nowadays, a small company can also do so much business because of the advent of technology. They can sell their services and goods and services from any location that they're in. So anyway, students, so today's lecture, we've covered a lot, but what I want you to do, okay, I'm going to put a thank you on the final slide that you look at. Please go through the portal, and also you're gonna get your you'll have your assignment uploaded. Have a look at that. It's totally related to this topic of FDI and globalization and its impact. I want you to go through it, read it, and also please read the text as well. And I've got a lot of podcasts as well that I've recommended, the journals. Remember, as part of your studies, you have to do as much research as possible, do as much reading as possible. Remember, this is where your knowledge, is almost like a 90-degree angle. Please go through it, and in the next module we'll cover another topic. And it's great to see you all, and look after yourself, and I'll take leave today. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.